Hello class, so now we're looking at the Summa Theologica by St. Thomas Aquinas, or as this edition has it, Summa Theologiae. So the Summa Theologiae or the Summa Theologica, was written somewhere between 1225 and 1274. And so we know that St. Thomas Aquinas died in 1274. So we also know that the Summa Theologica, sometimes referred to just simply as the Summa, was unfinished. And so to be sure, we know that this was a summary, basically, a summation of all theology up till then. So, in other words, Aquinas was envisioning this book as a textbook to help theologians understand the theology and philosophy up till then, up till 1224, up till the 13th century in Italy. And so we're only looking at one small part of it. So let's go ahead and click there. So we're looking basically at question 94. And this is from a section in the Summa on law. So this is from the treatise on law. And so we have this very specific question here on the natural law, which is what we're studying. And so basically, Aquinas here is setting this up to ask a question about natural law. Essentially, what is it, right? What is natural law? What are its precepts, etc., etc. So we're going to focus on the precepts. And also, is there a single natural law for everyone? So let's scroll down. So we have several articles that are basically sub categories of the question. And so we're going to look at Article 2. Does the natural law contain many precepts or just one precept? Okay, so does the natural law contain one precept or, many precepts or just one precept? Or just one precept. So when we look at how this is set up, we should know that these objections here basically are common misunderstandings, and Aquinas is seeking to clear up these common misunderstandings. So if I were handing this to you in class, I would say, well, it'd be easier if you just started right here with I respond, because this part right here where he writes I respond, that's really his main argument. So he's clearing up these questions, and we already know that the question has to do with natural law, and that the question is, does natural law contain many precepts or just one precept? And so he's going to seek to answer that. And if you want answers to 1, 2, and 3, he actually answers those even more specifically as we scroll all the way down here, right here, okay? So these are the replies to the objections here. But what we're going to do is we're just going to look at the argument for now, okay? So this is a way that scholastic thinkers set up their way of answering questions by way of disputation. And so here we have it. So he's responding, so this is basically his main argument. So as was explained above, the precepts of the law of nature bear the same relation to practical reason that the first principles of demonstration bear to speculative reason. For in both cases they are principles known per se, or per se nota. Now this word per se here really just means something that is self-evident. Okay, so in other words, they are principles that are known to be self-evident, is how we could read that. So they are known to be self-evident per se. Okay, now he's writing that there are two ways in which something can be known per se, and he's then thinking of a way that we're thinking of this idea of how we could start answering this question. Does natural law contain many precepts or just one precept? So if we look to what he wrote as the answer here to objection 1, insofar as these precepts of the law of nature are traced back to a single first principle, they have the character of a single natural law. So in other words, we're looking at focusing on one principle by which all others stem. Okay, so then we look at this. So for instance, the proposition, a man is rational, is known per se, given its own nature, since anyone who expresses man expresses rational. And yet this proposition is not known per se to someone who does not know the real definition of a man. Okay. So then he points out that certain fundamental truths and propositions are known per se in general to everyone, and these are the ones whose terms are known to everyone. Every whole is greater than its part. Things equal to one and the same thing are equal to each other, whereas propositions are known per se as self-evident only to the wise, who understand what the terms of the proposition signify. So if we continue here, so there's a certain ordering among those things that fall within everyone's apprehension. So then here he's referencing being and non-being, so having to do with metaphysics and also the law of non-contradiction, interestingly enough. So we also know as a self-evident truth that one is not to affirm and deny the same thing at the same time. Now, what you have to understand is that he's setting up this idea that we know things reasonably, a man is rational, okay? And that's where we start working on this difference between something that is speculative. So he's thinking of first principles of demonstration bear resemblance to speculative reasoning. And so speculative reasoning for Aquinas essentially means to you and I something that's scientific, something that's logical, something that is descriptive. Okay, so this is descriptive reasoning here. Okay, so in other words, this is the way we understand something logically and descriptively / scientifically. Okay. Then now, just as being is the first thing to fall within apprehension, absolutely speaking, so good is the first thing to fall within the apprehension of practical reason. Okay, so he's just cleared up how we understand speculative reason in this abbreviated way to understand these basic precepts of reason. Okay, but now he's distinguishing practical reason from speculative reason. Okay, so practical reason is not speculative reasoning, as he has it up here. Okay, so there's speculative reasoning. All of this right here has to do with speculative reasoning. Scroll, scroll, scroll. Now remember that the way in which we understand things is based in this type of reasoning as well. And then we move to practical reasoning. And this has to do with an idea of goodness, right? And a way in which we are ordered toward an action of goodness. So then we have for every agent acts for the sake of an end, which has the character of the good. And so the first principle in practical reasoning is what is founded on the notion good, which is the notion the good is what all things desire. Therefore, the first precept of natural law is that good ought to be done and pursued, and that evil ought to be avoided. And then all other precepts of the law are founded on this principle. So let's repeat this again. So the first way in which you know you are oriented toward the right thing, toward goodness, is understood by reason, practical reason more specifically. And practical reason for Aquinas can also be what we understand as conscientiousness or conscience. And then it's also understood as synderesis. So these principles, this first principle here, that the good ought to be done and pursued and that evil ought to be avoided, is basically the first synderesis rule, or the first precept of how it is that we should orient ourselves as practical agents, right? And then so all other precepts of the law are founded upon this principle. So, and what we're thinking of here is that since what is good has the character of an end, and that which is bad the character of the contrary of an end, it follows that all things man has a natural inclination toward it follows that all things man has a natural inclination toward are such that a reason naturally apprehends them as good, and thus things that ought to be pursued by action, and reason naturally apprehends these contraries as evil, and thus things that ought to be avoided. So then we are looking at these three here. So essentially we have 4 precepts already, right? So this would essentially be the second, the third, and the fourth, because the first he named up here, right? So then the second, he has it here as the first, basically is that we are sharing in common all substances, okay? And that we then will aim to, and what belongs to the natural law in light of this inclination is everything through which man's life is conserved or through which is contrary to the preservation of his life is thwarted. So in other words, we seek to aim for a preservation of life, including our own and the lives of others, right? So anything less than that is not good. So then second, man has an inclination toward more specific goods, which respect to that nature he shares in common with other animals. Accordingly, these things are said to belong to the natural law, which nature teaches all animals, i.e. the union of male and female, the education of offspring, etc. So in other words, this third precept is emphasizing our responsibility toward reproductive rights, and then also our educating of the offspring. Okay, so these are ways in which we are inclined toward the good. So then thirdly, or fourthly in our case, we're looking at this way in which we're oriented toward the good. Those things that are related to this sort of inclination belong to natural law. For example, that a man avoid ignorance, that he not offend the others of whom he has to live in community, and other such things related in this inclination. So in other words, we have an obligation toward our community, and this is an aim toward the good. So if we follow these precepts, we're doing good for Aquinas by way of natural law. Okay, so we'll talk a little more about it and take it from there.